Achtung, Achtung! Welcome, one and all, to the Independent Company live stream. I think New Tech, second week of New Tech. A number of you expressed concern last week about the melting state of Mr. James Holland, who looked more like he was broadcasting from Hill 170 in the Arakan than opposite a watercress field in the Chalk Valley. So, how's he looking tonight, Jim? How are you doing there?
I'm pretty good, I think.
Oh, yes, you're a cricket champion of unprecedented glory, perhaps.
Yes, I am actually, as it happens.
And is that the trophy?
Well, it's my individual trophy. As you can see, it's absolutely magnificent. It's almost as magnificent as the Raspberry Ripple Cup we were given.
Hold it right up to camera, because that's got a kind of Soviet vibe. If it's got anything.
Yeah, it's Soviet vibe.
Look at that. Those bales are being tumbled aside by a Red Army ball.
Read that. Hold on.
What does it say? It's too close. It's too close to your Dorset T20 Cup winners 2021. I think a small round of applause there for one and all.
I'm very proud of that. Very proud of that. Okay, so I didn't actually contribute massively to our victory yesterday, but that's not the point. It's a team game, cricket.
Yeah, exactly. Teamwork makes the dream work, and those extra 3 runs of yours could have been all the difference.
You said that we won by 82 or something.
Yeah, but you'd have won by 79. So, three runs for the extra crushing defeat.
I definitely think I was responsible for their gun player getting out, because he was an ex-Somerset Twos player, and he was unbelievably good. Yeah. And he was just pacing us all over the place. And then our captain came on, Joe World, and it was ripping quite nicely. And he saw me at short third man, and obviously for silver top, can't feel for his life. So try to reverse sweep.
Oh dear.
Missed, got bowled.
Beautiful.
Yeah. So I thought I played a very strong part.
You did. Well, I'm sure you did, James. And everyone out there in We Have Wasteland who basically sponsored the team is part of this glorious victory. So
they are in a very real sense.
Yeah, every single one of them a Kerry Packer in the making.
Yeah, you can share in the Chalk Valley CC victory.
Right, now, tonight, ladies and gentlemen, we have a guest for your delectation, former major in the British Army, light infantry, I understand, but is known these days as one of the leading authorities on the Burma campaign. It's Dr. Robert Lynham. Welcome, Rob. How are you doing?
Hi, Al. Hi, Jimmy. Very, very nice to be on here again. This evening with you.
Fantastic to have you with us. Did you win any cricket cups at the weekend at all?
I was absolutely crap at cricket, although I do love it. I tell you, I'm absolutely loving the Olympics at the moment. It's taking my mind off other things that I should be doing, like work. But no, it's really, really exciting seeing these youngsters get out there and strut their stuff.
Yeah, it's fantastic, isn't it? And are you watching any of this 100 thing, the newfangled cricket, the speed dating cricket?
I've watched it on and off. I unfortunately I haven't committed to it fully, but it's very exciting. But it's really good. You can
watch it between courses of your dinner. It's over so quickly. Anyway, now a few bits of news before we put Rob through his paces, and we've got a little bit of film to show you as well. Firstly, the big news about the festival is that it is sold out. 1,000 of you will be joining us in September. Yeah, we sold out a long time ago, some say, James. The 1,000 of you will be joining us in September, and it promises, Better Britain, Dambusters, and it promises to be quite a party. Thanks to everyone who's committed to coming. We've booked a load of great guests and tanks. This morning we were discussing the schedule, weren't we, James? The program.
Yeah, we were. And we've got some humdingers, haven't we? Just tell everyone about the because it's anniversary weekend of Arnhem Market Garden. Obviously.
I mean, we start.
Obviously, we've got a whole load of original Market Garden artifacts coming, courtesy of the Parachute Regiment. They've got their own little stand, and they're going to bring some stuff.
Yep.
Things with bullet holes in, aren't they? And all sorts of stuff.
Yes, that's right. So some artifacts for you to see. And Hal Sosabowski, great grandson of Stanislav Sosabowski, the great general, the commanding officer of 1st Independent Polish Parachute Brigade, will be joining us. And what he doesn't know about his great-grandfather's battle ain't worth knowing. And who else is joining? And Peter Kelly.
We got PCA, obviously.
And
we're hoping John Buckley.
That talk's called Market Garden 10% failure ? And that's what we're going to be talking about. I'll be in there batting for Monty, I expect.
Yes.
And we've so much else.
We have got a lot else.
Go on. What else we got, Jim?
Well, we're doing a thing on the back of the Atlantic, aren't we?
Yep.
We're doing a Nazi thing with Guy Walters and hopefully Luke Daly Groves, although he doesn't know that yet, but he's going to in very, very quick order.
Waitman Bourne will be joining us, who I know is on the message board there somewhere, ticking away.
Yes.
Waitman's joining us, I think, with Alex Ritchie and with help me out, James. You wrote the program. Katya, of course. Katya to talk about the Eastern Front.
And Alex Ritchie, all the way back over from Poland.
And like scores.
And we're hoping committed is Nicholas Frank.
Yeah,
he is coming as it stands. As long as he can get over here.
Yeah.
He's committed. Colin Bell is coming.
I don't know why we're selling this. They've bought the fucking tickets already.
I know, but let's get them more excited. But we've got Stan Perry, the last surviving troop commander from the Sherwood Rangers.
Yeah. So
total ledge,
basically,
and it's looking very good for Brian Johnson.
Exactly, as the two Ronnies would say in a packed program tonight. We've all that to talk about. Also, by the way, we have a new audiobook coming your way. I hope you've enjoyed Louis Hagen, and we hope we've fixed the problem with the chapter we had. It's called A Very Private Diary, A Nurse in Wartime by Mary Morris, and it's being read by Willow May Murray, my daughter, who said, "Oh, can I do an audiobook?" And she's done a fantastic job on it. Absolutely brilliant job on it. Sent her off to her bedroom with a microphone and all the equipment, and she
go to your room.
Yeah, go to your room and do something productive, I said, and so she did.
No more screams.
This book, she said the book was incredibly harrowing, which is interesting. So I've not only has she made herself some money, she's fully traumatized. So it's
What's
a perfect teenager double whammy. But
it's a perfect book, actually. It's a great diary.
It is a really great book, and that'll be on the Patreon soon. Right. Before we get talking to Rob, because there's so much to talk about, and before we came on air, we'd got going already discussing Burma-related stuff. What we thought we'd do is show you just a glimpse, a quick look at our recent trip to see the Mosquito being looked after by Andrew Panton and his team at the Lincolnshire Aviation Heritage Centre in East Kirkby. Turn your sound all the way up. 2 Merlins, full blast. Here it comes. Tally ho, tally ho. Welcome to We Have Ways of Making You Talk from a secret location in Lincolnshire. What's over there, Jim?
Well, the reason I'm grinning like a because
salivating.
We are next to a very sexy airplane.
Extremely sexy.
We're next to a de Havilland Mosquito. How cool is that? I mean, this is absolutely one of my favourites. I mean, Spitfire, Mitfire. I mean,
oh, absolutely.
Yeah, I guess it's the first kind of multi-role, really versatile aircraft. It's effectively a composite aircraft. I guess it's made of Sitka spruce and balsa. So it's all kind of a laminated structure within the fuselage. The only metal bits are the engine bearers, the undercarriage, and the nacelles and cowlings. So the whole wing and everything's all made out of wood. The wing's in one complete section, so the aircraft is effectively built around the wing. So the wing's the strongest item, and the fuselage is just bolted on top of it.
But we're going to start up the engines, aren't we?
Yeah, we've got a 7-day run to do on it. So with the Merlin engines, they're overhead cams, so you've got to keep oil at the top of the cams, otherwise it starts to wear them. So you have to run it every 7 days to keep oil up there. So that's what we'll do this afternoon.
Fantastic.
And earlier on,
one lucky man.
James made the greatest sacrifice of all. Greater love hath no man that he that gives up his seat in a Mosquito when the engines are running. James said, "No, you go." I think a bit hotly. I think he went a bit early on that.
Yeah, he's just slightly regretting it now. But the deed is done.
Brilliant.
So you need to clamber into the cockpit, or try.
I'll try and get in. I'll try and fit.
We don't want another situation like it was with the Hawk.
No. A friend of mine once got in a Spitfire and tore his trousers. They're literally ripped as he sat down in the cockpit.
Really?
Very, very, very funny.
Yeah,
we're not going to repeat that now. Anyway, so shall we?
Yeah, absolutely.
Jim, you happy watching?
Yeah, I am.
Here I am in the navigator's seat of this Mosquito. Waiting for Andrew, and we're going to start the engines, and that's going to be deafening, I'm told. Right, Okay, we're going to close these windows, keep the noise out, right?
Well, yeah. So Al is just moving off across the old East Kirby airfield. Obviously, doing a little bit of what's called a taxi run, which basically is the most frustrating thing you can ever watch because you're seeing a mosquito which is born to go incredibly fast in the sky, doing nothing but whirring its engines on the ground. But it's absolutely fantastic, isn't it? I mean, it's still fantastic to see the mosquito and to get a sense of the scale of it and what it sounds like with those two Merlin engines, Rolls-Royce Merlin engines running. And it's just wonderful. It's the most amazing sound. No two ways about it. Sheer racket.
I'm not getting out. You can't make me get out.
Going to stay here, there,
yeah, I think I might. Yeah.
Thank goodness you've made it home.
That was
Was that something else?
absolutely extraordinary. And the really the amazing thing was when we'd first taxied, suddenly we were the other end of the field because I was filming it on the phone. I wasn't paying too much attention to how quickly we were going. Suddenly we covered all that ground. You were all dots, and then I mean the noise is absolutely exhilarating as well, as you might
It's
expect.
pretty tight in there, isn't it?
You might expect, yeah.
And what's fascinating is seeing the side of the cockpit. You can see it sort of. You can really see that it's made.
Oh yeah, it's made of wood. This thing is definitely made of wood. Yeah, without a doubt. And then there's this space behind here.
Yeah.
That that's the rest of the canopy space is quite spacious. I mean, that was the most extraordinary thing, I have to say.
You'd have a pretty chummy relationship with your navigator, wouldn't you?
You'd have to, yeah. Although Colin talks about nodding off and his navigator, making sure he's
Doug is
keeping his hand on the tiller to make sure he's going the right direction.
Yeah, but that's something that all makes sense now.
Yeah,
you're in there, doesn't it?
Yes, it is intimate. Yeah, but I mean, what
visibility pretty good.
Actually, yeah, really good, really good. Yeah, all round, and this isn't a brand new piece of armoured perspex, but you can see well enough. I thought that was absolutely extraordinary, and thanks, Jim, because it could have been
that
you.
was pretty noble, wasn't it?
It could have been you. Every day I win the lottery.
You do on We Have Ways of Making You Talk.
Yeah, I mean, when we first started this podcast, I thought that's a mugs game podcasting. It's not going to amount to anything.
No.
And here I am, refusing to get out of a mosquito.
I'm not coming out.
A gasoline.
I'm not. Oh, come on, Alistair. You need to come down.
The smell is amazing.
Let's get the Colonel on.
Anyway, yeah, I'll get out. I'll get out. But what a thing! What a treat! The de Havilland mosquito, ladies and gentlemen. And I think it's not a competition, this podcast, but I've won this episode. There we are. That was I mean, what a thing, eh?
Yeah, that was quite hard work, I've got to say.
It was very sweet of you, James, to make
I know. Well,
noble sacrifice, fall on your sword like that.
Next time, when we go on that 2-seater P40.
Yeah. Yes, the 2-seater P40. That's the thing. Yeah, that they have at Biggin Hill have just taken delivery of a Kitty Hawk, and they've basically got to jump through some hoops to make sure they can take a passenger up in it. But yes, that's pretty cool. I mean, people are talking about, it'd be great when that mosquito flies again. They aren't restoring it to flight. They're not going to, because they'd have to take it. They'd basically have to destroy it,
They'd have to start again, yeah. I mean, the extraordinary thing about that, Al, is that's a Mark VI. That was one of the most powerful fighter bomber aircraft in the Second World War. It had 4 303 Browning machine guns, that had 4 20mm cannons, that had 2,000 pounds of bombs. I went out to New Zealand in 2012 to see KA-114 take its inaugural launch, which is the rebuilding of that amazing aircraft, and people can see it online. It's absolutely incredible. And there's some really exciting things going on with mosquitoes in the UK at the moment, with People's Mosquito and the other program. So within a very few years, I think we'll have one flying again.
I think we will.
Yeah, well, I'm involved in a project on that, actually, because they're trying to do a 5-year documentary on the sort of update every year documentary on the People's Mosquito.
Oh, fabulous!
And so they're trying to raise money for the mosquito and for the project, which the film documentary, which will then hopefully help the whole fundraising thing.
Well, why haven't we gone to see them, Jim? What? Why haven't we gone to see them on the podcast? What?
Well, because I've only been in on it a couple of months, and I just keep I did a talk about the mosquito the other day, and I cribbed blatantly from Ronan White's proposal for the Copenhagen Gestapo raid one, and also from your book, Rob. I'm not going to lie.
Yeah, it's a fabulous story. The People's Mosquito.
But yeah, we should.
There are two, but it's absolutely amazing. And I'm just pushing out another book on the Amiens raid with some amazing.
We've done the Amiens raid.
I know. I'm doing it again for Osprey. It's coming out in a few months' time, called Operation Jericho, with some really, really good new artwork as well. So that story.
I just love that video of them all hurtling across the channel.
20 feet above the
it's
the
amazing.
ground.
And that's part of that raid, isn't it?
Yeah, it was. That cinematography was taken on that raid by the lone PRU mosquito, the Photographic Reconnaissance Unit, or FPU mosquito. It's quite extraordinary, the footage they got from that. But
it's on YouTube, isn't it?
It's on YouTube. But people also forget that a number of the aircraft on that raid had fixed cameras in the rear of the mosquitoes.
Right.
So one of the mosquitoes by called Max Sparks, one of the New Zealand pilots, had some of the most famous photographs of the raid were taken from the back of his Mozzie. Really
where was the spruce from? The wood?
Canada.
It came from all over.
Canada. Yeah. Well, it was an amalgam of different woods, but the spruce came from Canada.
Yeah.
It was also Douglas
fir as well. Yeah.
And there was another type of wood, wasn't there? There was what's the stuff from Venezuela or something like that, or Belize or something, or whatever, British Honduras or whatever it used to be.
Although it's made of wood, wouldn't wonder to save on metal. It's built on the presupposition that what you can do is get wood materials from all over the world.
Well, it was that as well, but it was also based on the supposition that anyone could build it. Any specialist piano maker, and there were lots of them in the UK, wood turner, woodworker, could make this aircraft. And that was the reality. The de Havilland mosquito factory in Hatford simply assembled stuff that had been built all over the UK. I mean, it's an amazing story. Ian Thirsk, who's we need to get in.
Almost the ex.
He is the expert on this. It's quite an extraordinary story. But I mean, just staying with the mosquito, Glyn Powell, who died last year, he was a builder, New Zealand builder, decided that he would make the molds to create a mosquito from scratch. And of course, everyone around the world said, it'll never happen. It's absolutely impossible. You won't be able to do it. He created the molds. He got the blueprints from Canada, where the last Mozzies were made, because the BAE refused to give them for reasons I can't explain on the podcast. And he built it. He built the molds, and Advac in New Zealand built the jolly thing. It was just the most amazing thing. And seeing KA-114 launch into the sky for the first time was one of the most seminal moments of my life. Forget about having children. It was seeing a mosquito take to the air for the first time since 1946 or 47. Absolutely unbelievable. And you can watch it, actually. Ben Slocum, a famous cinematographer, has got some really good video on YouTube of KA-114 doing its first flight with Glyn Powell in the navigator seat where Al was earlier.
Oh, extraordinary.
Fantastic. I mean, the birth of the mosquito is fascinating, isn't it? And yet again, Wilfred Freeman crops up. This sort of forgotten figure, really, who is just there in those early years of the war, and he ends up being, doesn't he? Isn't he sort of a deputy chief of the air staff for quite a long time, I think. But he's the guy. He signs it up and backs it when he's head of research and development at the Air Ministry, and because he takes over from Dowding, doesn't he?
Well, one of the real challenges. I mean, I think looking back to 1939-41, you guys have had this conversation a number of times, is how long it took for the British to get onto a war footing in terms of the way they thought, and what they should have been doing, and what they started doing in 43-44, is sponsoring 100 ideas and choosing one, rather than choosing one idea and losing it early on. So get every idea through the door, invest in it, spend it, and choose the best. We were rejecting fighter planes in 44, 45 that would have, beaten the world a couple of years before. So it was just a way you fight wars, and we took a long time in the UK to actually get our heads around what was needed.
Yeah. James, your pot is that is that the ECB?
It's my mum again.
Are you required for the 100, James? Have you been called up to the Manchester Originals or whoever? Right, now should we do some questions? Because we have lots of questions for you, Rob. And we
but that mosquito chat was quite good though.
It was very strong mosquito chat. Extremely. God, your mother wants in on the mosquito chat.
It's not. It's someone else, I'm afraid.
Very, very good.
Switch off. Sorry, everyone.
It's all right. Very, very strong mosquito chat, Rob. But Burma, I think, is the thing we haven't advertised you as a mosquito expert. That's taken everyone by surprise. So we thought we'd talk about Burma.
Great.
We were just before we came on. I was just talking about. I've been reading Rana Mitter's book about China's war with Japan, 37 to 45. And there's a lot of crossover that I'm sure we'll get to when we're discussing this, because after all, if you're from that end of the world, it's all the other way round, isn't it? If you're at so much of how the Chinese view the world, just as so much of how the British view the world, or the Americans, or the Russians, or the people in New Zealand view the world, the Second World War is where those tram lines were laid down. Indeed, for how their societies then turned out as well. The war is incredibly instrumental in that. So there's lots to talk about. We've lots and lots of questions. Paul Seaman kicks in with this. What difference would it have made to the wider war had Japan and China made peace, as almost happened in 1940?
Oh, well, I mean, that would have been an absolute disaster for the Allies. I mean, what people often forget about the war in Burma, when we talk about the Burma campaign, we're actually talking about the war in the Far East, not the war in the Pacific. And the really fundamental component of this was American strategy. Allied strategy followed American strategy. American strategy was to keep China in the war. Why keep China in the war? Because it was holding down probably between 50 and 60% of the Imperial Japanese army. And the Japanese were at war, of course, because they wanted to develop and grow and increase their empire. It was very, very simple. It was a war of Japanese imperialism more than it was anything else.
But Rob, they'd had massive growth, hadn't they? They were emerging as a modern nation, huge urbanization. Japan home islands are quite small. They can no longer feed themselves. They hadn't got enough resources, natural resources, to do what they needed to do to become a kind of modern first world state.
I actually don't believe that.
Oh, do you not? Okay.
No, I think that is the traditional Japanese argument for war. The fact of the matter is the Japanese could have achieved all of that and more had they opened themselves up to trade.
Yeah,
but we need to just bear in mind at the time that
that's a very good point.
Japan from the 1880s was a deeply militaristic society. It was a form of military feudalism, and we don't really have a sense of how disciplined it was. But there are lots and lots of Japanese memoirs from the 1880s and 90s onwards. Basically. In the Middle Ages, if you had four sons, one would follow you in the UK and England would follow you onto the land, the other would join the army, the other would join the church, and the other one would become a waif and stray and grow the empire. Japan was actually very similar. in the 1880s and 1890s, Japan was imperialism was the supreme virtue. And I hear all these arguments about in the 1920s and 30s. Rana Mitter is very, very good on this, by the way.
Yes.
The truth is that the Japanese empire and the Japanese move into China forcefully in 1931-32 was a consequence of a militaristic ideology and agenda that they had to act on. The problem is, just think about this: if you've got a militaristic society, if you've got a form of Nazi totalitarianism dominating the thinking about who you are as a nation, think about Großdeutschland and Germany, you have to do something about it. You can't just sit there and talk. Beer cellar talk doesn't do anything. You actually have to do something about it. And we know that what the Germans did, what the Nazis did, was converted to action. Look, the Japanese did exactly the same. In order to be able to create that warrior spirit, to enable the upper classes to become real samurai, they needed a war. And you even get the generals saying, well, at the Tokyo war crimes trial in 1946, saying, well, haven't you heard of Captain Perry? We learned it off you. They say it's Americans. You're the people with the idea of sort of expansionist military manifest destiny. If you don't mind, which is specious, I think. But there's imperialism is, as you say, in the late 19th century, imperialism is where the action is. If you're defining yourself as a nation state, the Japanese are brand new on the block in terms of defining themselves as a modern nation state. After all, Japan and China are intertwined. It's the same alphabet and so on. And you have Chinese people going to Japan, to universities in Japan, and vice versa. And it's an island off a continent. Is it that dissimilar to this country and the continent? It's no.
But also, Rob, I mean, it's now that you mention it, I mean, I'm sort of thinking about Germany. I mean, Germany was doing quite well as an industrial manufacturing nation in the second half of the 1920s. Then you have the Wall Street crash, and post-war, West Germany does that, and post-war, Japan does that, doesn't it? I mean,
absolutely right. I mean, the point about Germany is very interesting. You had a very successful. I mean, actually, Germany was doing very well on American investment to get out of the imbroglio that they had found themselves in with Versailles and so on. But they became enmeshed politically and emotionally in this ridiculous racist ideology that said there's a better way to recover your male virtue, and that's what it was all about. It was about male ego, and Hitler and the Nazi party hijacked this desire by Germans to resurrect the greatness of Germany through Großdeutschland, and militarism was the way ahead. Look, Japan was exactly the same. You have all these unemployed young men, employed only in the armed forces, army and navy. That's another really important dimension that we all need to remember, that the army and navy were basically fighting each other for political supremacy in Japan, and whoever won more battles and won more glory, and for Japan, would be paramount politically. That's a subtext that people forget. Katja Hoyer is very good about that in terms of Prussia. Think about Prussia as a component of the new German state. Who's the biggest, best state in Germany? Is Prussia. That's why that's the big strength of her book, getting us to understand that it's tribes within tribes that are really important to understand. Japan's really, really important to understand that as well. But I think the point is that Japanese hubris, I've often said this about the Nazis, hubris kept them going, and they kept them going over the cliff. It's exactly really the same, I think, in Japan, because the more they lost in China, the more they wanted to expand the empire to demonstrate they weren't really losing.
You get locked into an imperative of needing to deliver victories and to justify previous. Although, democracies find this problem too, that once they've started a war, it's quite difficult to extract themselves from them. But militaristic societies have that extra problem. After all, the other thing is, if you've got a great big standing army, it's economically inert, in fact, and costing you stuff. So if you can use it to conquer somewhere full of raw materials and stuff, and people who can work for you, but there's a point to it, isn't there?
Yeah. Well, so you made the point. You made the point, Jim. The point here about the Japanese needing oil and coal and so on. It wasn't to feed the population or to give them domestic heating. It was to fuel their navy, and they needed the navy in order to be able to dominate the Pacific.
Yeah.
So if you just go back to the 1920s, the Pacific was a battleground. It really was a Cold War between Britain, to a lesser extent France and Holland, but there was a little bit of it going on there, Japan and America. I mean, if people will be interested to know that actually America had two particular plans to take on adversaries in the Pacific. One was Code Yellow and the other was Code Red. One was to fight the Japanese and the other was to fight the Royal Navy, because we were the only practical impediments to the extension of American imperialism in East Asia.
Fantastic.
It's amazing. Well, you wrote about that in your new book, don't you?
I do, yes. Yeah.
Well,
have we answered that question? What was the question again? It was about
had peace been made in 1940, what would it make? What difference would it made?
Well, the British Empire and the European empires in the Pacific would have been absolutely destroyed and would have had no means of countering, because the Japanese would have been dominant in China. Basically, India may well have been lost as well. I mean, it's a great question. I mean, it's one of those great what ifs.
Well, but it also, isn't it? It sits alongside. Let's say Japan in December 1941 decides not to attack the Americans, but to do everything else.
Yeah.
Then it definitely takes India. It definitely completely, the British would have had no answer to any of that.
It's very interesting. I mean, I'm doing a project at the moment where I'm looking at British defence policy between the 1920s and 1930s, and I'm just astonished at how little we knew about our potential enemies. Well, actually, we weren't alone. The Japanese did not understand the American psyche, and nor indeed did Hitler or the Nazis. I mean, the fact that the Japanese launched an attack on Pearl Harbor, which Jim and I did some work on last year, was absolutely absurd. They could have achieved everything they wanted in East Asia without touching the Americans. Yeah. The Americans did not want to get involved in an imbroglio in the Pacific, even though they were fearful of Japanese ambitions. And they certainly didn't want to get involved in Europe. Why didn't they just leave Pearl Harbor alone? It's because they didn't understand, really. This is an absolute failure of Japanese diplomacy to understand what the Americans would do if their own boys were killed in battle. In an insignificant part of the American empire in Hawaii, which is a long way from American shores. But there's a lot of work, actually. There's a lot of work that's been done on those the journey to war, but no one's actually asked that question. No one that I've seen, because I've done a lot of work on this over the last couple of years. Why did the Japanese finally make that crazy decision? I've come to the conclusion it's because of internal Japanese politicking. The Navy wanted to demonstrate that it was more powerful and more successful, and would achieve more.
But they became completely obsessed with America because America was the bulwark they were up against. Diplomatically, America was sort of threatening them with oil sanctions and all that kind of stuff. So suddenly America, not Britain or certainly not the Dutch, are kind of they're at the forefront.
Yeah,
they're the enemy in what at that point is a Cold War.
And they didn't really regard the British as an enemy. Well, one of the things that the guys, people may not realize or know is that we appeased the Japanese massively in 1940. Churchill appeased the Japanese by closing the Burma Road because he didn't want the Japanese to have a course ballast for war. But but
Roosevelt was doing an awful lot of tough talking, wasn't he?
He was,
and then Kono, who is the prime minister up until whenever November 1940, is 1941 rather. He's a dove rather than a hawk, isn't he? As top tier Japanese politicians and generals go. And he's desperately trying to find a diplomatic solution, and a diplomatic solution might have prevailed had Roosevelt agreed to personal talks.
Possibly. The problem was the Americans had passed the Lend-Lease Act in 1940 and were pouring money into China via Burma. The point about America is that the Japanese could have achieved everything they wanted by seizing, as they did, Borneo and Singapore and Sumatra and Java. Now, the problem is, if you're a military planner and you're looking south into the East Asian region, you've got this big issue of the Philippines. And so you say, well, the Philippines is run by America. It's part of the American empire. Can I attack Borneo without being struck by the Philippines? And the Japanese said, no, we're going to have to take the whole lot out. Well, that was a mad decision, actually. It was an operational...
But Rob, sorry, but did you not? The Americans just wouldn't have stood by and let that happen.
Well, I think they may well have done. I think
they may well. I think they may
I'm
well
not sure
have
they
done,
would.
Jim.
Yeah, well,
so.
this is one of those.
I'm crossing my arms.
No. Look, it's a great discussion, but not enough people actually discuss this. The truth of the matter is that you needed to ask what was American interest at the time. That America was emotively involved in China. I mean, it was a little bit like sort of the ideas of American missionaries in China and little Chinese children and all this sort of stuff. You know, really pulled at the heartstrings of Americans. They were pouring millions of private dollars into donations to support the Kuomintang against the communists. And China had become this big thing. China had become the bulwark against communism and chaos. And it was the way in which the Americans would evidence the beauty and the simplicity and the power of the American dream. We actually saw this in the decade that followed the American Civil War. We had a massive American evangelical Christian missionary migration around the world. We saw it in India, massive in India. It really annoyed the Raj, for instance. And this was an attempt by America to reassert its moral supremacy and its exceptionalism. And by the 1920s, 1930s, it was completely dug deep into the American psyche. So in one sense, I agree with you, Jim. It's very, very hard.
There is no way that I mean, you'd have had MacArthur bleating from the rooftops.
Well, MacArthur was a nobody at that stage. That's a key point. Look, the truth is, the sequence of events is, if they had not invaded the Philippines, had just gone from Borneo, the question is, would the Americans have done anything about it? And the Japanese said, well, the Americans would. They follow your line. They believe you, Jim. They've listened to your argument. And they said, well, in order to prevent the Americans launching a counterattack against our offensive, we need to attack the Philippines. And in order to prevent any counterattack against the Philippines, we need to attack Pearl Harbor. That was the logic.
Just so much harder to get the Americans to take the initiative. You only have to look at the American ships being sunk by the Kriegsmarine, by U-boats,
and doing nothing about it,
and they're just not being able to do anything about it when there's an actual
war
going.
There's only the Reuben James.
Yes, but that's not the point, though, is it? It's the provocation still doesn't.
The casus belli was absolutely amazing. It had America had all the legal cause, to declare war. But Roosevelt, I think, in this sense, Roosevelt was smart because he wanted to get political opinion behind him, and he was helped by that really mad strategist or insufficiently competent strategist Adolf Hitler, who declared war without even telling his own high command that he was going to declare war on America on the 11th of December.
I mean, anyway, you still have to put Lend-Lease into proportion anyway, because the Chinese at the most get 4% of Lend-Lease, don't they?
Yeah,
bumping along at 1.5% at the start, isn't it?
Well, they even got less than that because they got less than the allocation, but at least 40 or 50% of the stuff that arrived in Rangoon never actually got into Yunnan. It was sold off en route by the criminal gangsters who were running the road.
Dreadful, isn't it?
It was dreadful.
Right. Okay. Well, so the thing is, I think that this dimension of the war gets talked about last, doesn't it? Is the truth?
Well, but just to go back from what you're saying, though, the fact that Roosevelt is going so strong with Japan in 1941, the oil sanctions and all that kind of stuff. They kind of sort of say they're not imperialists, and yet they've got the Philippines, and they've been pretty strong in the Philippines. They might not have declared war immediately, but at some point, Japan is going to overreach itself. They're going to realize that, and isn't it better to strike before you're bit? I cannot see a scenario where Japan attacks British interests in the Far East and America doesn't get involved. At some point. Maybe not immediately.
I think you've sort of given yourself the get out clause there by saying in time. I think I agree with you. I think in time.
No, I think in time, yes, but the whole point
not
of
immediately.
But the whole point of this is all about the Japanese are fighting.
Well, I'm talking 6 months to a year. I'm not talking.
But the Japanese are fighting the same kind of war as the Germans. They've got to knock the Skittles over very, very quickly before the Allies get the chance to pick them up. And and if they're not diverting that effort to deal with the Philippines and the Americans, then Burma's gone and India's gone.
Yeah, absolutely.
I know, but that has a massive knock-on effect for for the United States as well. I mean, I just
well, there are lots of things.
The fact there is there's ground zero in the USA in late May, early June 1940, just as there is in Britain. Yeah. There is this terrible moment where suddenly the Atlantic is not the kind of the Great Barrier that it once was. Ditto with the Pacific as well. I think Roosevelt is sufficiently geopolitically astute to realize that the Japanese are just not going to, never going to stop with just Britain.
I think there's a real problem. I think there's a real problem. So I agree to an extent with you, James. I think the problem here is that America, like Britain, had completely underestimated Japanese military capabilities. And I think one of the reasons why Roosevelt was so stridently anti-Japanese was he thought he could get away with it. He didn't think there was a threat from Japan. And all the advice he has been given repeatedly was that the Japanese didn't have the capability to cause America a problem. I mean, the truth was they could, but and actually,
the truth is they didn't actually really. I mean,
they gave us
as strong as they make out.
They gave us a problem between December 1941 and May and midway 1942.
Yes, you are right because imperial possessions out there are so woefully underprepared and unready. But the truth is they're not. I mean, and that
this is the problem. I mean, the Japanese, or Yamamoto said famously, he said, we were going to win the first battle but lose all the other ones. This is not a military campaign, because what you fail to understand, Mr. Tojo, is the immense strength that sits behind America, and when America is riled, they will win. Ultimately, they will win. Yamamoto said that from the beginning, and he was very clear.
He was bang on the money, wasn't he?
Yeah, he was bang on the money. But the problem is, this is a standard problem we have with countries declaring war. Their perceptions are often skewed. They don't really understand what's driving the enemy. That's why intelligence is so critically important. If you're going to go to war, make sure you do it for the right reasons, and you choose the right enemy, because Hitler got it wrong repeatedly. Japan got it badly wrong. I mean, I've often said that Japan's war in the Far East was, the longest suicide attempt in history, because it was, from the point at which they reached their high point in sort of May, June 1942, they never recovered. It was just a decline all the way through.
Yeah.
And they never renewed their equipment. Their technology was crap. It just declined. Look at the power of the Allies in every respect. I mean, you guys know better than anyone else. The transformation of the war in Europe, the equipment and the troops the Allies deployed in 1945 was incomparably light years better than anything we had in 1939. Japanese went to war in 1941. Nothing changed. It just got worse between 41 and 45.
Although again, one of the reasons the Japanese have the advantage in the field in 1941 is because they've been doing this for a decade.
Yes, well, that's right. That's true.
So I mean, when we talk about the German, after all, the German advantage the first 3 years of the war is that they've been preparing for this since rearmament, and then they tried on Poland, they tried on France, and they're more experienced, and in Spain they're more experienced. And that's one of the big arguments. And that has to be remembered about the Japanese as well.
They're and the Italians as well, for that.
Exactly. They're super. Well, yes, yeah. The Italians aren't picking on people their own size, are they? I mean, you look at the sheer scale.
Nor the Japanese, frankly.
Well, no, but the scale of the Japanese encounters in China are gigantic.
They are gigantic.
But it's a scale what does for them, isn't it?
But it's also the popular support. Japan was entirely mobilized for war. I mean, in 2000, when I first met a whole bunch of Japanese veterans, I was completely taken aback by the fact that all of them were unrepentant militarists. They had been brought up to believe. I mean, it was quite shocking. I mean, a few years before, I went to one of the last Africa Corps reunions, and that was exactly the same. They were all unrepentant militarists. I'm not going to say Nazis, because that's conflating two things together. But they absolutely believed in the manifest destiny of Japan, and you need to understand that. At no stage did the Italian population believe in the manifest destiny of Italy. They'd only been a country since 1868, in Garibaldi, and they were stuck together like glue. And there was not much to hold the warring states together. Japan, wow, it's a very coherent society.
So these veterans, Rob, these veterans you're talking to, I mean, how did that kind of militarism kind of manifest itself
Well,
in these old 80-somethings?
So either you or Al made the point at the start that, that one of the arguments that the Japanese used in 1939, 40, 41 was, look, the reality of power in the world is about who's got it and who hasn't got it. And you've got it through empire. We need a bit of a slice of the action as well, and we're going to take it. Thank you very much indeed. You can't stop us, and you've got no right to stop us. And actually, in so doing, we're going to make the lives of your colonial citizens much better. And they never really took that seriously. But look, in terms of one of the reasons that Germany held out for so long was because the state was, the people were behind it to an extraordinary degree, not behind Nazism, but behind the idea of Germany. The Japanese population very strongly behind the idea of Japan. They believed in their military. From the time of the Meiji Restoration in the 1880s, they believed that that military service was the ultimate virtue. If you think about civil virtue, what is the ultimate virtue? Well, it's defending your country. It's defending the interests of your country. It's becoming a samurai. And in those years, the idea of a samurai being linked to God, the manifestation of whom was the emperor, became so really significantly entrenched in the Japanese armed forces. And, the idea, I mean, we laugh at it now, but actually it was very, very, these boys took it very, very seriously, that when you joined the army, you took a clipping of your fingernails and some of your hair and you put it in a matchbox, you sent it home as evidence that you are now the property of the emperor, not of your birth parents. And you were obedient to your birth parents. And many of you will have heard me describe this in the past, this idea about Bushido. We never understood Bushido unless we understand that the ultimate purpose of a Japanese soldier is not obedience. It's not. It's death. Yeah. It's death, which is why we only took 600 prisoners in the whole of 1945.
Bloody hell. My God.
Yeah. Well,
that makes the diehard Germans in the last year of the war seem
like a bunch of pussies.
They all surrendered. The Germans, they fired the last bout of the MG-34 and they surrendered, or 42. They surrendered.
Yeah. Because the Japanese aren't on a, this is a war of empires, isn't it? After all,
yes, it
is. But the Japanese don't see themselves, of course, talking about imperialism and at the moment is as hot potatoes go, right? The Japanese don't see themselves. The British at best in their imperial efforts see themselves on a sort of civilizing mission, don't they? And then you get into Kipling and the White Man's Burden and stuff like that, right?
Yeah.
The Japanese do not see themselves on a civilizing mission in China.
It was an aggrandizing mission. Yeah.
And you've Chinese people who believe in a sort of Pan-Asian idea that there's a Pan-Asian future. The Chinese people are trying to get their heads around this and then retreat into nationalism. So Chiang Kai-shek is very much talking about he believes this sort of pan-Chinaism, and if only it could include the Japanese, but the Japanese they are not interested. And he wants to create a sort of Pan-Asian world that's a bulwark against Western imperialism and the answer to imperialism is this sort of grand Chinese nationalism, Asian nationalism. I mean, not unlike Pan-Arabism in post-war. Those sort of movements you get in the Arab world. It's not dissimilar, is it? But the Japanese are just not interested in this.
They're not interested in, and I think the one thing that needs to be emphasized is that the Japanese idea of imperialism and the way in which they executed was deeply racist. The Japanese idea was that they were the chosen people. I mean, the parallels with the chosen race and with the Aryan concept in Germany are really quite staggering. But they did believe, and this is my point, Jim. When I first met these Japanese veterans in 2002, they did believe that they were the superior race in Asia. And remember, they were looking at China. They'd been in Korea since the 1880s. And they saw that as a civilizing and a rescue mission because Korea had been in complete chaos. They looked at China through the same lens from 1909, 8, 9, and 10. They saw China to be in complete chaos, and they wanted to apply a civilizing mission to it, in which the Chinese and the Koreans would be their slaves.
Yeah.
The only country they effectively achieved that with, of course, was Korea, who provided all their guards and comfort women and logistical support through the Second World War. The people following up the fighting troops were Koreans because they were the Untermenschen, not so much as Untermenschen, but the next stage of racial segregation down. Japanese society was very, very racist. It had been a very pure society with no intermingling for at least 1,000 years, and that's what they were proud of.
Yeah, Rob, I've got 2 comments for you. The first one says is from Louis Hoskin, who says Rob is the PCA of the Far East. Could there be higher praise? And the second comment comes from Thomas McCall. He says, "Is this too much stress on samurai though? Most Japanese soldiers were conscripts on the countryside. How much did they accept, know, and understand of this before they joined the army?"
A lot. So the samurai concept, it was very, very deeply riven in Japanese society. I mean, children started learning it in kindergarten. So I talk about samurai quite a lot, and there's an enormous amount of evidence for this. Ranamita picks it up. There's a lot of research in Japan about this. The cultural superiority of the military ethos. We had a little bit of it in the UK or in England in the 19th century. It didn't really survive long. But the idea that there are a number of civil virtues. One is looking after your granny. The other is, making sure, the litter's picked up in the street and all the rest of it. But the primary civil virtue is a military virtue. And only the best can become a son of the gods, can become a samurai. It was really important in Japan. So much so that, so these hardy agrarian agricultural laborers who became the bedrock of the Imperial Japanese Army didn't consider this to be wrong or them to be doing anything other than what they'd been brought up to believe. We need to remember that this wasn't a conscript army from a democracy who want to go home as soon as they finished. They had been conscripted. They were samurais. For the first time, this little failure of a boy who was only plowing a field was in an army. He was a samurai. So his primary duty now was, he was going to go and die for the emperor. This was glory for people and glory for the families. They didn't say farewell to their soldiers going away worried that they wouldn't come back. They sent them away hoping that they would bring glory to the family. How?
Yeah, amazing.
By dying.
Amazing.
By dying.
Yeah,
amazing. I've got 2 more comments. First of all, is to say that Joe Ritchie's in the house, which is great.
Hey,
He's been off air for a little bit, so welcome to Joe. Back to Joe, who's joining us all the way from Louisiana. There in New Orleans. And the second one is from Simon Williams. Goes, hang on, does this mean we're on to question number 2?
No, we're still on. No, we're still on question
still on
1.
We're still on question 1 because I intervened with an extra question that wasn't lined up.
Yeah, I mean, Waitman Bourne has also made the point of you have to grind a fair dose of American anti-Asian racism into their prosecution of the war. You have to really have to take that into account too.
True.
And
British anti-racism. Mistrust.
Yeah. And the mistrust and distrust is drenched in everyone's dealing, but everyone's dealings with everyone is the truth. That no one trusts anyone. And China, after all, mid-war is split into 3 essential governments who are all vying against each other, trying to second guess which way the war is going to go. There's the government in Nanking that's basically coping with the Japanese. There's the nationalist government. There's Mao. Mao doesn't need to have a standing army. So Mao doesn't have the problems of a standing army and being economically inert and all that sort of stuff. So there's all these competing things going on in China, let alone what the Japanese are doing, let alone what the British are doing, let alone what it's, I mean, why this isn't more interesting to people, I don't really understand. I'm sort of having a revelatory experience with this book anyway. Right, let's move on to our second question, shall we? Should we do this? because
that is a brilliant one-liner.
We're moving on.
What, half an hour now? Stand by.
No. This
question
this will see us home. I can absolutely guarantee it.
Get us over the line. So, question 2 is from Peter Robinson, and he asks, "Oh God!"
Well, there's a very simple answer.
Move on quickly.
No, well, let's deal with this very quickly, Peter. There is a very simple answer to this. They
Oh,
were.
yeah.
Oh, really?
The answer is yes and no. Strategically,
okay, question 3, please.
Yeah. Oh dear. I mean,
Got it, Rob. Yes or no? You got to
no.
expand for at least 7 minutes.
Sorry about that. Right on the crack of the join there. Look, strategically, they were a failure. Strategically, there were lots of other really amazing things going on in the Burma campaign with long-range penetration that no one knows anything about. The 81st and 82nd West African divisions in the Caledon Valley, Special Operations Executive and Operations Otter and Character doing tremendous things in 1945.
Yeah.
The Chin levies, lubricating
V-Force.
V-Force. No, and look, I've spent a little bit of time over the last year talking to the army, the British Army, about this and just saying, look, for goodness sake, stop lauding the strategic and operational achievement, so-called, of the Chindits, because actually they were pretty thin. Look, but at the same time, the Chindits as an idea and what these guys individually achieved on the ground was mesmerizing. And when you think about that final advance up to Mogong and the Battle for Mogong to support Stilwell, it's incredible. The personal bravery, the commitment, the dogged perseverance. There's everything you ever expect or ask of a soldier. So the Chindits have my undying admiration. What doesn't have my undying admiration is Wingate's belief that the only way to defeat the Japanese was by long-range penetration, because patently that was absurd. And by the time the Operation Thursday was underway between February and June 1944, Slim was smashing the arse out of the Japanese in Imphal and Kohima and proving Wingate wrong. And that's the point.
Yeah.
Good answer. Let's move on to Barry Grogan.
Okay. I mean, the thing is I can't disagree with a word of that.
Cheers, Peter. Thanks for that.
So let's move on.
But let's face it, you know, the Chindits have given us the most incredible
the
stories, memoirs. Yeah. It's an incredible feat of arms, isn't it?
It was an incredible feat of arms. I mean, these boys were asked to do the impossible by Ord Wingate, who was he wasn't mad. He wasn't.
He was impossible. So
he was impossible.
So he asked the
pretty
impossible.
mad, wasn't he?
No. Do you know what? I've come up with this great idea about Wingate, which I put in my new book, and I think I'm the first one to come up with it. I actually think he was a religious eccentric. He believed that he was, because he was brought up in the Plymouth Brethren, he was really, really, really driven by his strong evangelical Christianity, really on the left wing of Christianity. And he had been persecuted since he was a boy. He had always been ridiculed. He had always lived on the outside of conformity, and he saw abuse and those sort of difficulties as a virtue. And so he thought the more abuse he received, the better he was doing his job. And the problem is he got this idea fixe. He had this fixed idea in his head about what the long-range penetration operations could do, and conflated what they did with their strategic effect. The reality is long-range penetration can achieve a really good operational effect. It can, in some instances, achieve a significant military effect. But changing the outcome of the war in the Far East, it was never going to do that, particularly when you didn't have any artillery.
No, my village GP when I was growing up, he was a doctor, and he was a doctor in the Chindits, and he kept the most fabulous diary. And actually, I must send it to you, Rob. It's absolutely brilliant.
Well, I would love to see it.
It's absolutely wonderful.
I am writing another book on the Chindits, and I want to take your hat off for these guys, because they were extraordinary. They achieved an amazing amount, but I do feel for them, because much of what they were doing in 44 was a fool's errand. It really was. In terms of achieving the strategic effect in Burma, defeating the Japanese, continuing to support China, there were many other better things they could have been doing, like patrolling the Chinwan and stopping Mutaguchi getting over the Chinwan. That would have been a good start.
Yeah.
Useful things to do. Rob, who was, apart from, you know, when he caught Churchill's eye, who was protecting Wingate? Who was sponsoring him and covering his ass?
Yeah,
because you know, eccentric soldiers like that crash about, don't they? And
okay, I've got another
mistakes.
theory about. That's a great question, Al. Listen, I've got another theory about this. You'll have to wait till the book comes out, but I argue that for much of British military history, we have always looked for our great man. We've looked for the man who has got the plan to transform defeat into victory. And Wavell, I mean, sent a number of messages back in early 1942 to Churchill saying, I'm looking for the man. He thought in Noel Irwin that he had the man to transform. You know, Noel Irwin had commanded at the last 2nd Infantry Division at Dunkirk. You know, he had a good reputation. He had messed up a bit at Dakar, and he was a pompous ass. But, you know, Wavell thought that he was the man who was going to turn the tide of the Japanese. This idea that actually forget about your soldiers, forget about their training equipment, motivation, morale, leadership. What you need is a great man. And Wavell looked to great men. A lot of his generation did. And he looked to Wavell. He looked at Wavell as a man who had ideas, and he protected him. Even though actually in the final analysis, many of those ideas just did not hold water. And the really sad thing about the whole Chindit imbroglio was that there's a fabulous riposte sent by Auchinleck, the great Claude Auchinleck, who was Commander-in-Chief India during the Quebec Conference. And the Quebec Conference, where Wingate had been given free rein, there was no one else from India Command there, said that the Indian army was crap. They were never going to defeat the Japanese. He presented a whole series of arguments for the use of long-range penetration under the command of American aircraft and his leadership. It's a really tendentious report. I mean, you can see it in the National Army Museum. I mean, you just read it, you think, blimey, this guy would get 10 out of 10 for his skills as a novelist, not as a military analyst. And it's even shocking to read it now. It really is. When you think through this, what he's arguing for, it's really shocking. But the point of the matter is that he got away with it because Auchinleck wrote a very, very long, sensible, calm deconstruction of Wingate's arguments. But Wingate was the man of history. Auchinleck was a man of history. He'd been sacked in the Western Desert. He had been sent to command India because, you know, he was the last man standing, and Churchill was not going to listen to him. And that's the problem. Yeah. You know, Churchill had, you know, great man as he was, made lots of mistakes. This idea of putting a man in who, well, you also need to remember, before I forget it, that Wingate was a savior for Churchill at the time because he was able to persuade Roosevelt that we had a man in India who could actually defeat the Japanese and who had ideas to defeat the Japanese, because the Americans were really looking at the British with some rather quizzically thinking, well, you guys really don't know how to defeat the Japanese. You haven't got any plans. You've been pretty crap at it so far. What are you going to do about it? And Churchill wheels Wingate out. That's my answer. And he satisfies Roosevelt. Remember, all that Churchill wanted to do was to persuade Roosevelt to follow his plan in the Mediterranean. And if Roosevelt said, yes, we'll support the invasion of North Africa, Operation Torch, and we'll go to Sicily and Italy. If you do that, then I'll do exactly what you want in Burma. We'll send Wingate in to fight the Japanese in Burma.
So Roosevelt's as susceptible as well to sort of someone.
And the American chiefs of staff, they loved Wingate. They gave him 300 aircraft. 300.
Well, he went to the Quebec Conference, didn't he?
He did. Yeah,
they were all over it.
Yeah,
as did Mountbatten, of course.
Yes, yeah. So have I answered that question? They were good and they were good and bad.
Yes and no. You see, because often one of the arguments is, you know, they made morale in 14th Army. You know, I don't know. I buy that. No, I think 14th Army was busy fixing its own morale. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I don't agree with that actually. I mean, that was the argument that Wingate's followers made. But look, just bear in mind, when we get to 1944, 90% of the 14th Army is Indian. And like the British Army, the Allied armies in Normandy in 1944, they're a brand new army. They were recruited in 1943, they're trained in 43, and they end up fighting the Germans in 1944. And that's what you guys have been very good at explaining. That's the same in India. The army in 1944 was recruited in 43. They didn't know anything about the Chindits. They were Indian, for goodness sake. They were trained. They had 11 months training to fight the Japanese. And when the crunch came, they did it brilliantly well. But morale or otherwise of the Chindit expedition by mainly British troops. Remember, Wingate hated the Indian army, hated Indian troops. The only Indians he would take were Gurkhas. Absolutely absurd, actually. But I don't really think that argument holds water.
Okay. Should we move on? Should we do this? Should we
do question number 3?
Should we why not? Why not? I mean, we've answered 2 questions. That's pretty good.
I'm going to have to go and get another bottle, so I need to sort of put an order in.
Well, Barry, you crack on and do that.
Barry,
while we read out
Jim's,
Mary's questions.
Jim's got this. Barry Grogan, how much did success in Imphal and Kohima contribute to the eventual defeat of Japan, or was it too remote from the main theatre?
Okay. No, did you know what, Barry?
You can't go off and get your wine yet, Rob.
No. But Barry, great question. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what defeat actually means. So there is military defeat, and there is moral and material defeat as well. It's really important that we understand that whilst Imphal was a critical military defeat on Japan, you can't argue that the Japanese gave up because of Imphal. But what we need to remember, and I only really started clocking this when I first went to Japan in 2000. I started talking to Japanese veterans. When you talk to a Japanese veteran and you talk about the Second World War, what battle do they talk about? Do they talk about Iwo Jima? Do they talk about Okinawa? Do they talk about the Marshall Islands and Philippines? No. The Second World War in Asia for the Japanese is summed up in one word, and it's Imphal. The cream of the Japanese army in Southeast Asia, a formed up Japanese army, infantry, aircraft, artillery, was sent into India to defeat the perfidious British, and they were defeated massively. It was a massive defeat.
They were annihilated.
They were annihilated. You're absolutely right. So the moral effect on the Japanese was really, really significant. And when you leap forward a year, they were annihilated again, of course, in 1945 at Mekhtila, Mandalay. When you look at the arguments that the Japanese were having amongst themselves, have we been defeated? Well, oh gosh, yes. Well, we have been massively defeated. Our army, our wonderful army, the army of our God Emperor has been defeated in Imphal. It's been defeated at Mandalay, Mekhtila. It's now been defeated in Manchuria by General Zhukov and the Russians massively. That was an extraordinary campaign, by the way. It had the arguments in Japan were prior to that. Well, the Americans have just taken another island. They haven't defeated our army. They've just taken another island. They haven't defeated our army. That's the narrative that's going on.
Because the people on the islands aren't an army of maneuver.
No,
they aren't an invading army. They're garrisons.
Absolutely right.
And they're not the spearhead of the imperial effort. Yeah, absolutely
right. So the Japanese. So there is an argument that says the Japanese only surrendered because of the atomic bombs. That's not true. Let me just categorically deny that on air tonight. The Japanese surrendered in 1945 because they realized they could not continue against the overwhelming power that the Allies deployed against them, and that was evidence and success at Imphal, at Mekhtila, in Manchuria earlier, just before the atomic weapons were dropped, and in amazing American success in the Pacific campaign, starting in Guadalcanal. So the reality, all of that coming together demonstrates very, very clearly that the moral failure of Japan to sustain its argument that their militarism was superior to anyone else's. So yes, so the answer.
Do you think they would have surrendered without the atomic bomb?
A year later. People need to remember that in July 1945, the Japanese mobilized 1 million people, civilians, in their dad's army to repel the Anglo-American invasion they knew was coming in 1946. They weren't stupid. They knew that the next thing was coming was the invasion of the home island.
And it would have been horrific.
It would have been. So my argument, I mean, this sort of came to me not very long ago. If you think about this big debate about the atomic weapons in the Far East, the atomic weapons, dreadful as they were, killed fewer people in Nagasaki and Hiroshima than the firebombing of Tokyo, reprehensible though I think that was. The reality is, if it wasn't for those atomic weapons, a very, very large number of innocent Japanese would have died in 1946. Forget about the the casualties that would have accrued to the Anglo-Americans invading the home islands. This is about Japanese civilians. This was another Gotterdammerung. This is another Berlin 1945, where Hitler wanted everyone to die to prove his point. And the atomic weapons, the dropping of those bombs actually removed that problem. But going back to that question, Imphal was critical. I mean, I will always press this. I'm not a Max Hastings fan in his terms of the argument that he has that it was entirely peripheral. You've got to take the war as a whole and look at all the consequential actions that added up to a totality, which, when you look at it rationally, meant defeat. The Japanese had been defeated. A very famous Japanese foreign office official after the war wrote a book on the war, the decline of the Japanese empire, in which he said Imphal was the turning point. Here was a joined up, formed up Japanese army in the field being defeated by the Allies. He interestingly said, it wasn't just the Allies, they were defeated by the Indians. How embarrassing is that? How embarrassing is that this army of samurais is defeated by an army of sepoys? I mean, dear me, the Japanese had their noses rubbed in it and they hated it and they realized they'd been defeated. So physical and moral victory, they're really two important things that you need to hold together when you consider.
Well, I'm glad we've had this conversation, Rob, because that's where I'm heading next, as you know.
Yeah,
And,
that's right. It's fabulous.
I've been wondering what to call it for weeks. This new book, because you just can't call it Imphal. You just can't. It hasn't got. It's just, well, it's not the same as all. So I'm now going to. I'm thinking of calling it The Crucible.
Yeah. Well,
I was going to say that. How honestly, Jim? I mean,
take 10% out. That's worth taking.
The Crucible, the Battle of Imphal and Kohima, 1944. Is that what I'm thinking of calling it?
Yeah, that's good.
Oh, it's pretty strong, don't you?
Yep, Crucible's cool.
Tipping point.
Well, I called my book Japan's Last Bid for Victory.
I
mean, the problem with publishers is, of course, unless you're really tough, publishers will often get their way. And mine was called Japan's Last Bid for Victory. I mean, it's quite expressive, but it doesn't trip off the tongue. I tried to demonstrate that's actually what the Japanese were trying to do. They were trying to prove their military virtue and one last gasp. It's
that we've talked about this a lot, haven't we, Rob? But had Mutaguchi got into the beyond
the Brahmaputra Valley, I mean, absolutely.
It's game over for the Raj, isn't it?
Game over, absolutely.
In which case, it's then game over for the American and Allied airfields in Assam, which then means it's game over for the hump and the supply chain for Chiang Kai-shek, which then means China is on a knife edge again, and
people forget
that could have changed things.
People forget, I mean, dear old Fergal Keane ended up congratulating Sato for managing to recover a lot of his 31st Division Vakima. Now, I have an entirely different view. Yes. Sato was too pig-headed to recognize what the strategic goal of prize could be. If he just continued on,
get distracted. If he hadn't been distracted by Shangsak,
Sangshak and Karasom and Ukral, I mean, it was a complete disaster for him. But
I remember Rob standing there on that ridge, looking back from where the Japanese attacked the Gurkhas. Across that little ridge. That little saddle in Sangshak, and you saying this is where it happened, and that entire company being blown away.
Quite extraordinary, isn't it? Well, we just need this COVID menace to disappear, and we'll be back there. But as many people as possible need to get Sangshak. I mean, what I really want to do is,
if anyone wants to come on a tour of Imphal and Kohima, join my gang. Honestly, I'm heading out there in January. It's going to happen.
Fabulous.
I have to be right. I have to write a show in January, for Christ's sake.
All right, February then. Okay,
I'll write it on the plane.
Come on, you got to come. It's going to be laugh.
It will be fabulous.
Okay, should we move? Should we do another question?
Yeah,
because let's go 4 questions. This is a big one. In terms of words, it's just from Alan Wilson. Given Stilwell's disdain for the British and his strained relationship with Chiang Kai-shek, coupled with the General Isimo's reluctance to engage with the Japanese in favour of renewing hostilities against the communists, is there an argument that the resources in Lend-Lease...
Oh, yes, Alan, you are so completely right. I mean, this is absolutely right. In fact, there are a number of people in 1945, Mountbatten, who are saying this. The big argument in 1945 was, why are we still sustaining the airlift to China? Give us the aircraft. we'll launch an offensive into Upper Burma and we'll recover the Burma Road in a couple of weeks. And you know what they did? They did. And from December 1942 to February 1945, Slim's 19th Division got all the way across the Irrawaddy, northern side of Mandalay, effectively recovering the northern part of the Burma Road, after years of effort. But so I completely agree. Yeah, our effort was dissipated in Burma because of this strategic sort of semi-political imperative to support the Chinese. And ultimately the Chinese armies in Stilwell's NCAC, the Northern Combat Area Command, they did a good job, but they were pretty insignificant. They got as far as Myitkyina, and that was it. And it was the Chindits and then the 36th Division that under Festing, who took over from the Chindits and then marched down from Mogong down the railway corridor to Mandalay. So great question. A very simple answer. Yes. Thanks, Alan.
That was quick.
That was. I'll tell you what. So we'll move on. That's what we're going to do. Do you see that? We're clawing the average back. This is from Chris DJ Dapper Dan Brown. A late relative was a doctor living in Nigeria. He was attached to a Nigerian unit that went to Burma.
Oh yeah.
And joined the RAMC. He was Can Rob tell us anything about the role of the doctors who were the Nigerians and how they fed in this campaign?
I can. In fact, without taking too much time, go on YouTube and see Griff Rhys-Jones's whatever it was, because I helped Griff do that in 2000, and it must have been 2015 now, a long time ago. And we went to the Gambia and what was the Gold Coast. Look, so when these regiments were raised in Nigeria and West Africa in 1943, I mean, that's really important to remember. They were only raised in 1943 for the purpose of going out to fight in Burma. They were provided with a complement of British officers, British NCOs, and British support staff, including doctors. And there's been a lot of argument over the years about how right that was. Should you send British NCOs to support African units? I think on balance, it was right. And the reason why I think it was right is because these were brand new troops with no military tradition, and expecting Nigerian or Gambian conscripts to be able to provide experienced NCOs within 3 or 4 months would have been foolish and would have just allowed them to fail in battle. So that argument is fair enough, but I think actually on balance it was the right thing to do. And of course they didn't have enough doctors. I mean, in Africa to be able to support the raising of this army, and there were quite a few, including Griff's father, and it was a seminal experience for them. And do you know what? In many respects, I think it was really good for Britain as well. Here was an army going to war where the fighting was undertaken by the 81st and 82nd West African divisions in Arakan. They did an absolute stonking job in 1945, by the way. Talk about Hill 170. Yeah. Look, the 81st West Africans had been on air supply for 9 months, and they had managed to divert, I would go so far as saying, if it wasn't for the West Africans in the Caledon Valley in 1945, the amphibious operations against Akyab would have been a complete disaster because they would have been opposed. The Japanese withdrew their troops from Akyab because the West Africans were behind them. It's a really good example of long-range penetration having a significant strategic effect. But there are lots of doctors doing a fabulous job. So go on YouTube and see for the life of me, I've forgotten what that program was called, but it was great fun and
it was really good.
It was good, yeah. And lots of doctors were involved in the 81st, 82nd, 83rd West Africans.
So how many West Africans are we talking? Just for numbers for people.
About 30,000. About 30,000 Africans in the 11th East African. 2.5 divisions: 81st, 82nd, and 11th.
Yeah. And who were they recruiting? People from villages, people from cities?
Yeah. Well, there's a lot of argument about this. There were actually quite a number of volunteers from both the cities and villages. But actually, if you look at the detail, the British district commissioners were given targets to achieve, and they would go out and literally bang the drum in villages and say, come on and support the King Emperor. Very interestingly enough, we do have this patrician and often racist sense that the Africans just didn't know what was happening. It's not true. It's absolutely not true. In the same way that it wasn't true the Indians didn't know what was happening in 1941. And Griff discovered this in 2015, talking to the boys, and he asked them, well, why did you join the army? He said, well, we didn't want Hitler to come down in Africa, and we didn't want the Japani to take over Asia. We weighed these things on the balance and decided it was worth our while fighting. They weren't stupid. Yeah. There is this terrible idea, this post-colonial view that we forced them to do what we wanted them to do for our interest. Yeah, largely that's not true.
I mean, after all, Chiang Kai-shek goes to India to talk to Gandhi and Nehru and Jinnah, and he goes to them as an anti-imperialist. He says, "I'm here as a God's honest anti-imperialist. That's what I've been doing my entire career, trying to form a Chinese nation that exists outside imperial notions." And he speaks to them as anti-imperialist to anti-imperialist, and says to Gandhi, what you've got to do is the greater threat is Japan.
Yeah.
And he's last, and Churchill's livid about that he's meeting anyone at all, and he has to arrange to meet Gandhi and all this sort of stuff, and it's having to be filtered through British input and all this sort of thing. And he finds Gandhi basically sort of sentimental and soft, and can't understand why Gandhi can't be more hard-headed about his decision to get involved in the war. And he says, and he on his last day in India makes a radio broadcast where he says, Nanking, remember Nanking?
Yeah,
and he says on the radio to India, he says, if the Japanese win this war, it will set back the cause of Indian independence by 100 years.
Yeah,
and it's quite it's explicit.
Yeah, I mean, this is just doing a little advertisement for Rana Mitta's excellent book. He describes that particular incident very well, but it's not very well known. And I think one of the sort of lessons for me over the last few years is just the essential duality of human nature. We are perfectly capable of holding two or three things in emotional and political tandem and deciding momentarily what's better for us and the world and our community than another thing. So, and I think this is the point about Indians as well. I mean, I was really struck by this when I first interviewed this guy who became a hurricane pilot, and he said to me, Rob, I knew about Nanking. The last thing I wanted, any of my friends from school wanted, was the Japanese marching into India and taking away our liberties. It was a terrible, terrible thought. And the moment I turned 18, I joined the Air Force. And to a lesser degree, that was the case in Africa as well.
But it's also George Orwell when he talks about half a loaf. That if you're in politics, if you can get half the loaf, that's better than that. You're
starving. Yeah, you're absolutely right.
And Rob, briefly, what about the INA?
Complete distraction.
Chandra Bose and all that.
Yeah, complete distraction. We need to remember that Subhash Chandra Bose and the INA were actually tools of
the Subhash Chandra Bose International Airport at Calcutta.
Yes, it's hilarious, isn't it? I mean, your friend and mine, Hemant Katosh, is very, very keen on the INA, and he and I have had long and lively debates about the influence of the INA. I mean, militarily, of course, they had no influence on operations at all. But what the INA did is they represented a certain idea
This is the Indian National Army.
This is the Indian National Army, yes, largely recruited from Indian Army prisoners of war at Singapore and Malaya. And I think this is the point. India was not a homogenous whole throughout the Second World War, in the same way that Britain has never been a homogenous whole. There are tribes and sub-tribes and tribes within sub-tribes. And what people forget when they talk about India and the Second World War is the fact that actually, there was a very noisy Hindu-dominated Congress that wasn't democratic in the sense that we would understand it. And there was another very, very, very strong voice in India under Nehru in particular for arguing for Muslim independence from Pakistan. And the attitude of those two groups of Indians was so diametrically opposed. It's a little bit like an English nationalist and the SNP. I mean, they have a lot of things in common actually, but but Nehru and Gandhi didn't. And the idea, what they were doing is they weren't fighting for independence. They were fighting for a transfer of power between the current holders of power who were the British government and their appointees in the Raj, and a new government of India.
Well, and Changashek just doesn't understand why they're pissing about with this sort of a way of looking at their problem of being part of the British Empire.
Because Chiang Kai-shek sorted it out with the communists. He's done a pact.
Well, no, but he's also thinking you've won a precedent that needs fighting. Why are you arguing about the post-match settlement rather than dealing with your problem that's actually in front of you? Yeah. It's
but that's what he's managed to do in China, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, it's what he's done. But people don't realize that what Gandhi was doing, this naked fakir, as Churchill called him, was trying to build up a power base in Congress. He was trying to build up a power base in India, and he didn't have his eyes outside. He wasn't a strategist. And for a long, I mean, there are many examples of him talking to people and saying, a number of guys went to him and said, should I join the Indian army and fight the Japanese? He said, yes, of course you should. Go way down, fight the Japanese. But that's not what I'm doing. I'm trying to create a power base for me, for Congress, for Hindu exceptionalism. And that's what he did.
It's very well described in this book that when he goes to see, when Chiang goes to see Gandhi, that they reach an awkward impasse in the conversation. So he goes back to weaving.
Yes, that's right. That's right.
You bugger! I need a straight answer out of you.
Well, he's saying you've got a battle to fight. I've got a battle to fight. I know what yours is, and it's Japanese, and I'm very happy to privately tell people to join the Indian army, but I'm not going to do that publicly. So I'm going to keep on weaving my basket.
Now, should we try and squeeze one last question in? Because we're into our last
wafer thin question.
Well, wafer thin question. Not the one from Andrew Watt.
We've lost that.
Yeah, because we've just sort of covered that. What about Simon Edwards? How about that? Is it possible to compare and contrast the opposition the ordinary Tommy faced with the Japanese in the East as opposed to the Wehrmacht?
Oh, very easily. Very easy indeed. I mean, we've touched on this a little bit. Bushido can't be underestimated. The Japanese fought with an intensity and ferocity that is just really extraordinary, right until the last. And right until they were told unequivocally by other Japanese officers that the emperor had surrendered. When the Japanese surrendered very meekly, but minutes before they were killing British soldiers who were bringing them the message. So the British very, very quickly in August 1945 realized that the only way they were going to be able to get the message out was to get as many of the Japanese surrendered enemy personnel as they could and let them go out and tell the Japanese. The Japanese fought with a ferocity that we never saw in Europe. I mean, when you run out of ammunition in North Africa or Sicily or Normandy, more often than not, you could lie back there and accept a surrender. And for the most part, in Western Europe, certainly surrenders were sacrosanct. Not in the Far East. I mean, a very good friend of mine.
I mean, just think about this, Rob. On the Battle of Peleliu. What was it? 14,000 Japanese. I think 64 prisoners.
Yeah, I mean, it really is extraordinary.
Like I mean,
so this idea of the Banzai Charge, we also get wrong as well. It was an expression of virtue. Well, let me just tell you that, of course, if you're a Japanese officer, you could never use a pistol or rifle. You had to use your sword because it was dishonorable to shoot someone. You had to kill them with a sword. So I mean, we've really got to get our heads around the nature of the enemy we're fighting, and that's the first thing. And that didn't change through the entirety of the war. It was the fear and the frightening element of this, being exposed to Japanese soldiers that so put the, so scared British and Indian soldiers in 1941 and 42 that led to.
It's that relentlessness of it, isn't it?
Yeah.
When you come up against them, the only way you're going to win is by killing them all.
Japanese had this.
That's a terrible thing that you've got to do.
That's it.
You've got to kind of come to terms with that. You've got to inflict that on the enemy as much as you've got to resist their own urge to kill you. I mean, it is a total dog-eat-dog scenario.
Every single soldier had to be determined to kill the Japanese in front of them, not to take the surrender, not wound them, but to kill and kill and kill and kill, because that was what the Japanese wanted. I mean, and the British in 1944, the 14th Armies began to realize that, and realize that for the first time, and that was a part of the transformation in understanding what the enemy wanted. The enemy were not meekly going to surrender anywhere. So any strategy, any operational plan that designed to push the Japanese into a pocket that then forced their surrender, as would happen in Europe, would fail massively, because the Japanese would then just eat out the pocket. Couldn't do it.
Yeah.
So the way to defeat the Japanese was to bypass them, was to hold them on by the nose and bypass them and just let them wither on the vine. And they would get very irritated. At the end of the Imphal fighting, they got very, very angry that the Allies weren't fighting them, and they were being forced to flee through the jungle because they'd run out of food. Masao Hirikubu, who was one of the supply officers for the 31st Division, one of the regimental supply officers, I interviewed him in London in the late 1990s. He was an extraordinary guy. We don't have time to talk about him now, but he got an OBE from the Queen. Masao Hirikubu, I interviewed him on one occasion. I said, Masao, when you were defeated at Kohima, he said, we were never defeated at Kohima. We ran out of food and we had to withdraw. Blimey, that was 1999 or something. And I thought, oh, it was a real.
I mean, after all, they're not. The Japanese don't want victory. They want to
battle.
Die.
They want an honor. This is, we talk about this. I mean, Japanese feudalism needs to be understood. If you want to understand the Japanese in the Second World War, you need to understand the way in which society was constructed. There's no other way of comprehending it. Just doesn't work.
Well, or any of the competence. You have to understand British society to understand.
Well, it's true, and you need to understand why the Germans kept on fighting. Grace of Deutschland was an incredibly important part of their psyche. Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
Well, Rob, this has just been fantastic. I remember that trip we did to Kohima and Imphal so well, and we had so many fantastic conversations. Whether it was going up to Barrackpore, whether it was just off the road where the two Indian Army forces met.
Yeah.
When the siege was lifted. Do you remember that chat?
Yeah.
Whether it was at Sangshat, whether it was standing on that kind of sort of that tower overlooking Kohima.
Yeah.
We had some absolutely fantastic conversations. Or whether it was sitting on the banks of the Hooghly. I mean,
that was a blast. Yeah.
It was a great time, and it's just, gosh, you get the grey cells going. I mean, it's so fantastic.
Well,
There's so much to discuss and think about and chew over and ponder, and it's just brilliant.
Yeah, but I mean, what we haven't done is talked about the environment. Even we've, what the jungle's like. We've not even we have literally not touched.
Well,
on
in
that.
February you'll find out.
Yeah, all you have to do is
Right.
fly over the hills into Imphal, and you think, mile after mile after mile of these jungled corrugations. You think, how could anyone ever have fought on this? And in the monsoon.
Do you remember when we were on the where were we? Shenham Saddle.
Was it? Saddle,
and we were on that track, and we had that photograph, and it was the same road, same hills, and there we were, and there were all those British positions or Indian Army positions, mortar hot pits, trenches, foxholes, and there we were in the grass. In fact, actually, I must dig out that photograph of you and I in there with our.
Do you remember Jimmy in Imphal? Do you remember Jimmy picking up a 1940 Radway Green 303 round? Do you remember that?
Yes,
for goodness sake, Kohima now, that whole place has been graded and it's beautiful manicured lawns. He's still found a round from the battle.
Yeah, we persuaded.
Because I said, you'll never find anything now. Don't bother looking for it, Jimmy. And he went away and came back with one.
Yeah. Amazing.
Well, Rob, thanks so much for joining us tonight. I think I speak for everyone on the sidebar of shame. A war of empires, Japan, India, Burma, and Britain will be your century.
Oh my God, it's so good, this book. Honestly, I was lucky enough to get a preview copy of this, and I've read it, and it is a brilliant piece of scholarship. And it's put you, Rob. I mean, no one would doubt this, having had this conversation. But you are right at the forefront of historians on this subject, and it's absolutely your best work as a work of history, without a shadow of doubt. And everyone needs to buy it.
I agree with that. I think everyone needs to buy it. Start ordering it now.
It's a brilliant piece of work. Really, really good. And of course, you will be there in September.
I'll be there in September. Yeah. So come and talk to me. And on the 24th of September, so the weekend after, James and I will be doing a stand-up,
a skit at Chelsea.
At Chelsea. So come along and listen to that as well.
Terrific. Well, thanks everyone for watching. No live cast this time next week, as James is taking a well-earned break. I don't know what I'm going to do.
Well, no, I'm happy to do it. It's just I'll be in the Lake District, and I just know what Wi-Fi's like.
No, you deserve a week off, James. You've worked very hard.
You can have 1 week off a year, and that's it. Okay.
Yeah, and then you can toast your winnings as a 2020 champion. Thanks everyone for watching. Rob, thanks again as ever. A pleasure to have you on board. We'll see you all soon. Goodbye.